American soldiers weave through the lethal fire of Panther tanks. They've come all the way from the beaches of France, penetrating deep into Nazi Germany to reach the last industrial hub sustaining Hitler's empire. Only a few miles stand between them and the final strike that could end the war. General Maurice Rose's group, the fearless leader driving the push forward, is quickly surrounded by German tanks. Forced to come down from the vehicle, the Nazi commanders open fire, taking Rose's life in the blink of an eye. The staff doesn't even have the time to pay their respects, scattering into the woods before the enemy can strike again. For a moment, the loss of their leader halts the American advance, but they've come too far to back away now. The Americans surge ahead, their speed and firepower overwhelming the enemy. Sherman tanks press through enemy lines, while artillery fire clears the path for the infantry to close in on their target. The Führer's final fortress is about to come crashing down. Tale of Two Armies. By 1940, Europe trembled beneath Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht. 7 nations were swallowed by the jaws of the Third Reich in quick succession, their armies crushed with lightning speed. But by 1945, the legend of Nazi invincibility was a tale of the past. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German supreme commander in the West, reportedly lamented the state of his forces in the later years of the war, describing leading them as, quote, playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. For the last 3 years, a new contender had joined the fray, the only one who Hitler had challenged with a formal declaration of war: the United States of America. When American cadets first arrived in Europe, they were overwhelmed by the realities of the war. 2/3 of them had never even held a rifle before enlisting. But as years passed, they evolved into a pack of seasoned warriors, claiming the beaches of Normandy as they marched into Hitler's fortress. Now, their sights were set on the ultimate prize: Berlin. The days of the almighty Wehrmacht were over, but as the Americans marched deep into Nazi territory, they braced for the danger ahead. Years of battle had taught them the Führer never backed down without a fight. Across the Rhine. On March 7, 1945, the sound of thousands of American troops marching forward resonated across the Rhine River. As the men advanced, they cast wary glances at pillars holding the Ludendorff Bridge beneath their feet, ensuring none of the cracks in them grew deeper before taking another step. Earlier, the Germans had detonated explosives in a last-ditch effort to bring the bridge down and stop the American passage. Smoke filled the air as the charges detonated, but luck was no longer on the German side. And when the dust cleared, the Ludendorff still stood. From his vantage point, General Omar Bradley of the All-American 12th Army Group stared in astonishment at the bridge. Turning to his fellow generals, he exclaimed, quote, "This will bust him wide open." He then commanded as many soldiers and war vehicles as possible to cross before it collapsed. But it would take more than a single miracle to win the region. The Americans were still 300 miles from Berlin. Strongholds loomed along the way, chief among them the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. This heavily fortified region, essential to the Nazi forces, was defended by Army Group B, commanded by the ruthless Field Marshal Walter Model. Known as the Führer's fireman for his ability to manage even the hottest of battlefields, Model commanded over 400,000 soldiers. Though Hitler's empire was crumbling, these men remained determined to resist and dug into strong defensive positions that threatened to turn any Allied advance into a massacre. A direct assault on the Ruhr risked disaster for the exhausted American forces. However, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower saw another path to victory. Instead of a frontal attack, he envisioned a bold encircling maneuver, a classic pincer movement that could trap the German forces in the Ruhr and neutralize their strength without a costly battle. If successful, the plan could crush the Nazi resistance in the West and pave the way for the final thrust toward Berlin. General Courtney Hodges' First Army would lead his men east, while General William H. Simpson, stationed approximately 90 miles further north, would follow with the U.S. Ninth Army. Once they made contact, the two armies would converge behind the Germans. The two groups would be out of contact during their advance, unable to warn each other if Field Marshal Model had identified the threat and was about to counter. Operation Plunder. After 10 days of relentless use, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way on March 17th, collapsing into the waters of the Rhine below. It had served its purpose, enabling thousands of American troops to storm into enemy territory. Yet, while this tactical triumph secured a foothold on the eastern bank, it was clear to Allied commanders that the bridgehead alone was insufficient for the grand maneuver they were plotting. A bigger, bolder crossing of the Rhine was necessary. Enter Operation Plunder, a multi-pronged assault designed to force the Rhine and open the path to ultimate victory. The operation commenced under the leadership of General Simpson and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. As night fell on March 23rd, the skies and riverbanks erupted into chaos. The air was thick with the scream of over 5,000 Allied guns as they unleashed a barrage of shells against the enemy, pounding German defenses on the opposite bank. Operation Plunder was a full-spectrum assault. On the ground, Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles from the British 79th Armored Division, plowed through German fire. These modified Churchill tanks were a nightmare for the enemy. Flame-spewing crocodiles, with their terrifying 120-yard reach, turned Nazi bunkers and fortifications into ashes. The ARVEs, or Assault Vehicles Royal Engineers, blasted apart concrete defenses with spigot mortars, their flying dustbins obliterating obstacles in spectacular bursts. German soldiers who spent years fighting across Europe had never seen a fire like this in their homeland. On the river, American engineers worked with desperate urgency to construct pontoon bridges under constant bombardment. Their hands moved fast while shells flew overhead in order to build a path vehicles and troops could utilize to brave the currents and bring supplies to the other side of the Rhine. On March 24th, reinforcements came from the heavens. Thousands of aircraft filled the sky in the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Over 16,000 paratroopers from the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and British 6th Airborne Division descended on German-held territory, their parachutes obscuring the skies as they came down in support of ground troops. The sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed German defenders. Entire units were cut off or abandoned their posts, fleeing north in disarray. Despite marshy terrain that threatened to mire the tanks and sporadic but fierce German resistance, the Allies pressed forward. By March 27th, they had pushed 35 miles into German territory, securing vital ground. Every mile gained brought the Allies closer to the Ruhr, but while Simpson's 9th Army had succeeded, the final triumph still hinged on General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army advancing from the south. Hodges Drive. Nestled in the small town of Remagen, just 35 miles from Cologne, General Courtney Hodges launched the final push. Leading 3 heavy corps, Hodges faced a German stronghold blocking the path forward. Knowing this was no time for caution, he ordered his forces to open fire with everything they had, releasing a booming salvo that shook the entire town. The Germans struck back, but their counterfire was no match for the American assault. With clear skies above, Allied aircraft swooped down like hawks. The combination of overwhelming firepower and air superiority sealed the Germans' fate. By noon, the battle for the Remagen bridgehead was over. Hodges' corps didn't just hold the bridgehead, they shattered through it, advancing at a breakneck pace. On the first day alone, they surged 12 miles. By the second, they had covered 20. The speed was so intense that some infantry had to ride atop Sherman tanks to avoid being left behind. The American juggernaut rolled forward, leaving the Germans scrambling. Entire units crumbled under the pressure, surrendering by the thousands. On March 26th, a single corps unit captured 17,000 Nazi soldiers. In just 4 days, the First Army had advanced 80 miles, capturing critical towns like Gießen and Marburg. However, the mission was far from over. To complete the encirclement of Army Group B, Hodges' forces needed to pivot north and link up with Simpson's 9th Army. This maneuver would close the noose around the remaining German forces. The responsibility for this daring thrust fell to General Maurice Rose of the 3rd Armored Division. Rose tasked Lieutenant Colonel Walter B. Richardson with leading a high-speed push to Paderborn, 60 miles to the north. His orders were clear, quote, "Just go like hell." Task Force Richardson tore through the countryside, blasting past German roadblocks and carving through enemy columns, covering 45 miles in a single day. The advance seemed unstoppable. Suddenly, just south of Paderborn, the column slammed into intense resistance from an SS battalion bolstered by Tiger and Panther tanks. The ensuing battle was brutal, a 2-day slaughter between opposing forces. Tanks clashed at close range. Artillery rained down in all directions, and every inch of ground was hard fought. Amid the chaos, a German Tiger tank found General Rose's vehicle. His column was ambushed and forced to surrender. But the Nazis weren't taking prisoners, opening fire against Rose and his men, claiming the general's life and forcing his staff to flee. Despite the loss and the punishing resistance, the Americans refused to falter. Task Force Richardson sidestepped the remaining SS defenses at Paderborn and pushed west toward Lippstadt. By this point, the German forces were crumbling. Overwhelmed by American speed and firepower, they could only watch as the First Army completed its pivot, linking up with the Ninth Army and sealing the encirclement around Army Group B. Easter week. It was Easter Sunday when the Allied pincers snapped shut around Field Marshal Walter Model's forces, sealing off over 370,000 German troops. 14 divisions of Army Group B, 2 corps from the 1st Parachute Army, and millions of civilians in the Ruhr pocket. Any hope for a counterstrike was crushed almost immediately. Supplies within the pocket were critically low. Less than a quarter of the troops had functional arms, and fuel and ammunition were nearly depleted. Model's desperate request for air support was denied by Hitler, who refused to divert aircraft from other fronts due to Allied air superiority. When Model proposed a withdrawal or breakout, Hitler ordered him to stay put, convinced that what he called Fortress Ruhr could hold the Allies at bay for months. The Allies, however, wasted no time tightening their grip. Artillery and relentless airstrikes hammered German positions as U.S. forces advanced 6 miles daily, capturing towns and dismantling resistance piece by piece. The sheer inevitability of the Allied advance spread dread among the Germans. During an Easter Mass, parishioners reportedly began to hear the thunder of gunfire closing in. One woman whispered to the priest, quote, "Herr Vicar, they are here." Moments later, the doors of the church burst open, not from enemy fire, but from the barrel of an American Sherman tank. The soldiers, sensing the fear in the room, calmly entered, knelt alongside the congregation, and joined them in prayer. By April 14th, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies had cut the Ruhr pocket in half at Hattingen, forcing the surrender of the eastern section. By the next day, Model recognized the impossible reality of his situation. Fortress Ruhr had crumbled, and his army was finished. In one of his final orders, he directed non-combatant troops and older soldiers to surrender or return home. True to his oath to Hitler, Model refused to surrender personally, even as the western portion of the pocket fell on April 18th. For him, it was still one card to be played: escape. The endgame. As 24 Nazi generals laid down their arms in surrender, Field Marshal Walter Model fled the scene, refusing to be captured by the advancing Americans. Much like his Führer, Model clung to the delusion of defiance, telling his chief of staff as the Ruhr pocket collapsed, quote, "What is left for a defeated general? A field marshal does not become a prisoner. Such a thing is just not possible." With the Allies closing in on Berlin from both flanks, the once mighty Third Reich faced inevitable annihilation. The dream of a 1,000-year empire was about to face an abrupt end. On April 21st, after hearing a Berlin broadcast condemning his failure and denying any chance of redemption, Model realized he had lost everything: his command, his honor, and the war. In one last desperate act, the man known as the Führer's fireman decided to put an end to his life, consumed by the flames of a war he could no longer control. For the Americans, the battle for the Ruhr came at a tragic cost of approximately 10,000 casualties, but it delivered one of their most decisive victories of the war. In dismantling one of the final bastions of Nazi resistance, they shattered Germany's capacity to fight.